Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to follow this really fascinating and honestly kind of unsettling thread that starts with military interrogation, runs right through the science of hypnosis, and ends up connecting our political beliefs with our physical health. You know, when you think of hypnosis, what comes to mind? Probably some stage trick, right? Pure entertainment. But what if the principles behind it have been, well, weaponized? And that question, right there, is what kicks this whole thing off. So check out this quote. It's from a real declassified U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency report back in 1972. They're obviously not talking about a parlor game here. They're talking about interrogation. And that word, suggestibility, that's the key. That's what links this entire story to the mechanics of hypnosis. All right, let's really get into this. This report lays out the exact procedures that were used on detainees in Northern Ireland. And the goal, well, it wasn't just about getting information. It was about systematically breaking down a person's mind to make them more pliable. And the methods they used, wow, they were brutal and they were very systematic. First up, sensory isolation, cutting people off from the world entirely. Then disorientation, just shattering their sense of what's real. And finally, you pile on intense stress and anxiety. You take away sleep, you take away food, and you completely wear them down. And here's the absolute kicker. This wasn't just random, pointless cruelty. The report itself says these techniques were designed to create such extreme suggestibility that they could get false confessions. And not just any false confession, one that both the prisoner and the interrogator actually believed was true. Wild. So that phrase, suggestible state, that's everything. But what does it actually mean, scientifically speaking? To get that, we've got to look at how hypnosis is defined in a clinical setting. Yeah, you can forget all about the swinging pocket watches and cliches. Scientifically, hypnosis isn't some kind of magic. It's just a procedure, a way to guide someone into the state of super intense focus, where you get totally absorbed in your own head and just tune out the rest of the world. So this state, it really has three main ingredients. First, there's absorption, when you're completely lost in something. Then you have dissociation, where your mind can kind of separate things that are usually connected, like feeling pain versus knowing you have an injury. And last but not least, suggestibility. That's where your critical thinking just takes a back seat and you're way more likely to go along with instructions. Okay, but here's the thing. Not everyone is wired the same way for this. Research shows that about 30% of us are highly hypnotizable. On the flip side, about 10% are on the really low end. And it turns out this isn't just in your head. It actually lines up with real measurable differences in people's baseline brainwave activity. And this image here, this is literally what that difference looks like. Using EEG data from brainwaves, researchers can see people cluster into these really distinct groups based on how hypnotizable they are. The source material basically calls this a physiological roadmap of how open we are to suggestion. Okay, so what is actually going on inside the brain that creates this state? Let's peel back the layers and take a look. All right, so a major player in all of this is a part of your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex, or the ACC for short. Just think of it like your brain's mission control. It's always scanning for conflicts, like when you've got competing ideas or choices, and it helps you decide what to do. So in people who are highly hypnotizable, something pretty incredible happens. The activity in that conflict monitor, the ACC, it just quiets right down. And what that means is the parts of your brain that are all about self-reflection and second-guessing, they go quiet, while the parts that are about focusing on a task, they get louder. Basically, the brain just temporarily rewires itself to stop asking questions and just do. Now, here's where it gets really, really interesting. That same brain region, the ACC, it pops up again in a totally different field of study, the neurobiology of our political beliefs. Yeah, this is where the story takes a pretty strange turn. According to the source material we're looking at, neuroimaging studies have found these fascinating correlations between the actual physical structure of our brains and where we fall on the political spectrum. And two areas really stand out, that ACC we were just talking about and the amygdala, which is basically the brain's alarm system or threat detector. This table here, which comes from the research, it lays out these two really distinct profiles. On one hand, you have a conservative orientation that tends to correlate with a personality that values stability, order, and authority, and a physically larger, more active amygdala. Then on the other hand, you have a liberal orientation, which correlates with a preference for things like novelty and flexibility, and a physically larger, more active ACC. And boom, there it is. That's the mind-blowing connection. The exact same brain region that gets quieter during hypnosis, our conflict monitoring ACC, is the same one that's physically bigger and more active in liberals. And at the same time, the amygdala, our threat detector, is bigger in conservatives. This just opens up a whole can of worms, doesn't it? If our political leanings are tied to the physical shape of our brains, what else is connected to these same areas? And the source material follows this exact thread, straight into the world of public health. So it turns out the amygdala does more than just handle fear. It's also deeply involved in controlling our eating habits. And the lab studies on rats are super clear on this. If you repeatedly stimulate the amygdala, a process they call kindling, it can actually trigger compulsive overeating and lead to obesity. And this right here is where the source material presents a really provocative visual comparison. On the left, you've got a map of the 2016 US election results. On the right, a map of obesity rates by county. And I mean, the visual overlap between the two is pretty hard to miss. And this isn't just something happening in the US either. The sources point to similar data coming out of the UK, where research found a direct correlation between a person's body weight and whether or not they voted for Brexit. So all of this leads to a really wild, kind of startling hypothesis that's presented in the source material. Could the global rise in obesity be somehow related to the constant, ever-increasing sea of electromagnetic fields from all our technology? The speculation is that these fields might be subtly kindling or stimulating the amygdala on a huge scale, messing with the part of our brain that's tied to both our political gut reactions and our metabolism. And that's where we're left. This research weaves together this incredibly complex web, connecting interrogation rooms and hypnotic trances to the very wiring of our brains, our political tribes, and even our physical health. It suggests that the line between who we are on the inside and all the influences on the outside is, well, it's way blurrier than we probably think. Which leads us with that huge question you see on your screen.